Welcome to History Nestware. The past whispers you to sleep. Imagine this. You're a young bride named Margot in 1347 AD, standing in the doorway of a stone cottage at the age of just 15 winters. Henrik, your new husband, walks towards your marriage bed. With every anxious stride, the rushes beneath your bare feet crackle. His aged visage flickers with candlelight. Your father picked him for his 3 pigs and half an acre of barley, and he's almost twice your age. You grip the rough woolen shift your mother sewed for this very night, the same one she warned your hands quiver, and her mother before her. You can hear his pals outside, hammering pots with wooden spoons and shouting vulgar encouragements, while intoxicated by ale through the thin walls. Until they receive confirmation of consummation, they will not depart. You wonder if your mother's whispered warnings about welly duties could possibly prepare you for what's about to happen in this small, smoky room that smells of wet wool and unwashed bodies. Your breath comes in short gasps as Henrik's calloused fingers reach for the leather cord at your throat. This isn't a romance. Intimacy in the Middle Ages is like this. Superstition, religious fear, and survival instincts influenced sexual practices. In a culture that would seem completely alien to our contemporary conception of passion and desire. If you love learning about the hidden facts of history, think about clicking the like button and subscribing for more content like this before delving into these lost tales of survival and pain. Additionally, kindly let me know where you're listening by leaving a comment below. It's amazing to me that we're studying these old tales from around the globe together, bound together by our mutual interest in the past and transcending time and location. The medieval bedroom was a battlefield where bodies were turned into political regions, where pagan customs and church theology clashed, and where the most private moments of existence were controlled by strange and constrictive regulations that would make a modern person shudder. These weren't only individual decisions, they literally meant the difference between life and death, as well as eternal salvation and family honor. In Margot's society, menstrual blood was thought to be so harmful that it could kill crops. The improper sexual position might condemn your soul to hell for all eternity. And the idea of marital rape didn't exist because women were property. The marriage bed was never really private in medieval Europe. Ancient superstitions, the church, and the community all had an interest in the outcome of a marriage. There was no champagne and dancing to commemorate Margot and Henrik's marriage in the autumn of 1347 AD. Neighbors who had every right to request proof of consummation witnessed a business transaction sealed with body fluids long before the pair ever touched the wedding night ritual got underway. The bedding ceremony happened first, in which the guests would practically pull the bride and groom to their chamber, undress them while singing body songs, and then wait outside the door to hear the noises that would signify the marriage's legal validity, until they heard Margot's agonized sobs, evidence that her hymen had been broken and the marriage consummated. Henrik's friends refused to depart. This is where medieval closeness becomes really strange, though even married couples could commit deadly sins in their own beds, according to Catholic doctrine. A man who loves his wife too much is an adulterer. According to St. Jerome's declaration from the 4th century AD, even in marriage, excessive pleasure, according to the Church, fathers, corrupts the spirit. It was more than just religious theory. It influenced all facets of medieval sexual behavior. In his Summa Theologica, written around 1265 AD, renowned medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas outlined clear guidelines for married couples only on specific days of the week, during specific seasons, and in a particular position: man on top, woman underneath. Face-to-face was sexual contact permitted. Any departure was viewed as sinful, since it went against nature. Sexual contact during menstruation, pregnancy, or lactation was strictly prohibited, as was oral sex. The Church estimated that married couples would only be permitted to have sex roughly 50 days a year if all these regulations were adhered to. During confession, Margot's mother would have been taught these rules by the village priest. Every private moment was weighed down by the threat of eternal damnation. She had to make an impossible decision, as Henrik grabbed for her on a prohibited Wednesday during Lent. In a society where domestic violence was not only acceptable but also expected, she must either comply with her husband's wishes and risk her soul, or defy him and incur his anger. Fundamental misconceptions that would last for centuries formed the foundation of the medieval notion of female sexuality. Women were fundamentally flawed men, according to medical texts from the era that were influenced by ancient Greek and Roman sources. They merely have male genitalia inverted as their sexual organs. The ovaries were regarded as internal testicles, and the vagina as an inside-out penis. This was more than just ignorance. It was standardized medical information that was taught in European universities. The way that medieval people perceived female pleasure and desire was significantly impacted by these ideas. In the 11th century AD, the African physician Constantine asserted that women and men had different experiences of sexual pleasure. To conceive, they needed several climaxes and extended stimulation, because a woman could not obtain the required pleasure if she became pregnant after being sexually assaulted. This led to the strange medical idea that rape could not result in pregnancy. It was sometimes seen by medieval courts as proof that she had relished the encounter and was thus partly to blame. The wandering womb, a condition medieval doctors thought may lead to hysteria, insanity, and even death, may have been something Margot's mother had warned her about. They believed that the uterus could actually move inside a woman's body, moving downward to pass through her vagina or upward to suffocate her heart. Treatments included administering foul-smelling chemicals to the nose to push the womb below, or fumigating the vagina with pleasant scents to entice it back into position. The Church never fully succeeded in eradicating the intricate web of fertility ideas that were carried over from pagan customs into the medieval era. A clandestine knowledge of plants, rituals, and practices intended to promote conception, prevent pregnancy, or guarantee the delivery of male children was maintained by village-wise women who were frequently labeled witches by subsequent generations. Under the full moon, ladies would collect particular herbs in the trees that surrounded Margot's town. Tansy and pennyroyal were used to make pregnancy preventive teas. A human-shaped mandrake root was thought to boost conception when worn as an amulet against the skin. Despite the dangerously low dosage between contraceptive and death. Because the root was so expensive, medieval merchants frequently sold fake replicas fashioned from carved briar. Even pious Christians were unable to completely give up these activities, even though the Church formally denounced them as witchcraft. The distinction between magic and folk medicine was impossible to distinguish. In order to ensure future fertility, a woman may bury a portion of afterbirth beneath St. Margaret's threshold and pray to her for a safe delivery. To avoid miscarriage, she would conceal a piece of amber between her breasts and wear a crucifix. Church. Medieval contraception was a perilous concoction of poison, despair, and superstition. Women were instructed to consume wine laced with ground-up bees or to jump backward 7 times after sexual activity in order to avoid getting pregnant. Potions containing lead, mercury, and other poisons were more hazardous and frequently killed the woman as well as any unborn child. Unwanted pregnancy had serious repercussions. Without effective contraception, women were always at risk of dying. During childbirth, the rates of maternal death were startling. During or soon after delivery, 1 in 3 women passed away. Pregnancy frequently meant death, exile, or social ruin for single women. Although officially denounced, infanticide was commonly perceived as a desperate woman's final option. Medieval marriage talks were fought like wars, with the main battlefield being human bodies. Margot's virginity was literally her dowry when her father arranged her marriage to Henrik. It was worth more than any gold or livestock he could provide. As evidence of their daughter's innocence and their personal reputation, relatives began exchanging the hymen, which turned into a symbol, Ofenar. There was more to the wedding night than consummation. The bride's virginity was to be publicly confirmed. The crowd would be shown the bloody sheets as evidence of the validity of the marriage. The bride might be sent back to her family in shame, labeled a fraudster, or even slain if no blood showed up. Young brides were under a great deal of pressure. Some would conceal chicken blood or covertly pierce their fingers in order to fabricate the proof that their new families required. However, the conception of virginity in medieval medicine was utterly faulty. Instead of seeing thiamin as a partially flexible tissue, they thought it was a solid membrane that totally closed off the vaginal opening. They believed that its absence was unquestionable evidence of sexual activity, but it can actually be ripped by strong lifting, horseback riding, or just anatomical variation. The doctrine of consummation in the Church gave rise to its own peculiar customs. It became a matter of judicial investigation to prove or disprove consummation, because a marriage was not deemed legally binding until sexual activity had taken place. Both husband and wife will be questioned separately by church courts over personal details of their wedding night. They would ask neighbors what they had heard through the walls and check the woman's body for penetration. Although church doctrine tightly limited mediaeval sexual positions, the reality was far more nuanced. The role of missionary was not Marilla favored. It was the only job where you wouldn't be damned to hell, because it went against the natural order of male domination. The church believed that any position that placed a woman at the top was against nature. Rear entry was viewed as bestial, equating animal mating behaviors with human sexuality. However, literature from the Middle Ages suggests a more nuanced reality. Sexual interactions that would have scandalized the religious authorities are depicted in Thefablio, bawdy, humorous tales that were popular in medieval France, a shadow world where couples experimented with illicit behaviors despite the prospect of eternal damnation is shown by these tales, which are frequently performed by itinerant minstrels in pubs and market squares. Around 1184 AD, the French poet Andreas Capellanes wrote about complex courtship customs that included specific guidelines for sexual postures and methods. According to his research, there was a sophisticated knowledge of sexual pleasure that transcended the church's constrictive precepts, at least among the nobles. These tactics were risky secrets, though excommunication, banishment, or death could result from discovery. Because sexual demons were thought to prey on people when they were most vulnerable, medieval people lived in constant fear. The incubus and succubus were more than just myths. They were recognized as religious and medical facts. According to church doctrine, these devils could entice men and women by assuming human form and robbing them of their vitality through sexual contact. Sexual dreams, nocturnal discharges, and any sexual ideas that took place outside of marriage were all attributed to the succubus, a female demon that tempted men. Theologians in the Middle Ages came up with complex explanations about how these demons worked. In their view, a demon may first assume a female shape in order to obtain a mansman, and then change into a male form in order to use the stolen seed to impregnate a woman. It was thought that any child produced from such a relationship was demonic or cursed. Medieval women were significantly more at risk from the incubus. It was claimed that these male demons could overwhelm their captives since they were physically stronger than people. Women who reported having unexplained sexual dreams or experiences were frequently suspected of hanging out with demons. The distinction between witch and victim was incredibly blurry. Sleep paralysis was perceived as demonic sexual assault, but it is today recognized as a physiological phenomenon. It was thought that men and women were being attacked by demons when they woke up immobile, frequently feeling pressure on their chest. Many alleged victims were burned as witches despite the church's extensive exorcism and purifying practices. Fear and superstition were the foundations of the medieval conception of menstruation, which would last for centuries. It was thought that menstrual blood was poison, so poisonous that it could sour wine, harm crops, and make men less virtuous. Menstrual blood, according to the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, whose writings were still studied in medieval universities, could make blades dull and drive dogs insane. During their monthly periods, women were viewed as harmful pollutants who needed to be kept apart from the rest of society. They were not allowed to touch holy things, cook, or enter churches until their bleeding ceased. Menstruating women in many places had to reside in secluded huts outside the community. Every monthly cycle served as a reminder of feminine humiliation, because the church claimed that menstruation was God's retribution for Eve's initial transgression. Strange medical procedures were formed as a result of a lack of knowledge regarding menstruation. Doctors thought that if menstrual blood wasn't adequately flushed out of the body, it would build up and harm the woman from the inside out. Recommended purging, bloodletting, and other risky procedures to harmonize the female humors because they thought that male seed may counteract the harmful effects of menstrual blood. Several doctors suggested sexual activity as a treatment for menstrual problems. In order to control their cycles, medieval ladies created their own proprietary knowledge. Their rudimentary menstrual protection consisted of sheepskin, cloth, rags, and moss. They used lunar phases to chart menstrual cycles and created herbal treatments to control their flow and relieve cramps. This knowledge was carefully concealed from male doctors and church officials who may denounce it as witchcraft, and it was passed down through generations of women. Extensive notions of sexual compatibility based on physical traits, body humors, and astrological indications emerged during the medieval era. Medieval doctors held that a healthy balance of hot and cold and wet and dry humors in both partners was essential for both sexual pleasure and reproduction. A cool wife and a hot husband may not get along, which could result in infertility and sexual dysfunction. In affluent households, prospective brides were frequently examined physically. Doctors would look for indications of the bride's sexual disposition on her body. Narrow hips represented breadness, whereas wide hips suggested fertility. The size and form of the groom's penis were examined to determine whether they would work well with his future bride. The same clinical detachment that examined livestock was employed for these examinations, based on spiritual rather than physical traits. The church authorities created their own views regarding sexual compatibility. They taught that sexual dysfunction and hideous offspring would be the fate of couples who were too closely related, either by blood or spiritual connection. Medieval marriages were eventually annulled when previously unidentified familial ties were found because of the intricate restrictions of consanguinity. The ideas honor, shame, and social status were intricately linked to medieval sexuality. A man's reputation as a leader and warrior was closely associated with his sexual prowess. Being impotent was more than a personal shortcoming. A man's reputation in his community could be ruined by such a public disgrace. Intricate euphemisms for sexual dysfunction were created by the medieval French, resulting in a vocabulary of shame that pervaded all facets of social interaction. Sexual repute was considerably more precarious for women. The honor of a woman's family and her chances of getting married could be destroyed by the smallest indication of impropriety. In the small communities off medieval towns, everyone was acquainted with one another. Even married women lived in continual fear of rumors and accusations, since the norms of female behavior were so rigid that a woman could be labeled as a jerk if she was caught chatting to a man who wasn't her husband or a family member. These sexual concerns were mirrored in the medieval judicial system's handling of sexual assault, adultery, and rape. It was believed that rape was a crime against the male who owned the woman, her father, husband, or lord rather than against the woman herself. The social standing of the victim and the offender had a significant impact on the severity of the punishment for rape. A peasant who raped a noble woman would be tortured and killed, whereas a nobleman who raped a peasant woman might receive a modest fine. Only women were subject to harsher penalties for adultery. If a married lady had sex with someone other than her husband may kill her without facing any legal repercussions. In particular, the Code of Medieval Law gave husbands the authority to kill unfaithful women and their lovers if they were discovered to be involved. However, there were typically no legal repercussions for men who had intercourse with unmarried women, prostitutes, or their own slaves. Complex courtship customs that would shape European culture for centuries were developed throughout the Middle Ages. In a parallel universe where sexual desire was elevated to a spiritual quest, Thetrabaders poetry popularized the tradition of courtly love. Although the nobles mostly appreciated these romantic ideals as literary fantasies, They had a significant impact on how medieval people perceived the connection between sexuality and love. True love could only exist outside of marriage. According to the courtly love tradition, it was believed that a knight's love for his lady would always be unfulfilled, that it would exist in a condition of perpetual longing. Thought cleans the soul through pain. This led to a strange division between romantic love, which was completely spiritual, and marriage sexuality, which was purely functional. Medieval courtship was a far more practical reality. Young people may have had some say in their marital partners among the peasantry, but economic factors always trumped individual preferences. A local girl could prefer the blacksmith's son, but she would be married to a guy she hardly knew if the miller gave her father better terms. Rituals intended to gauge a prospective spouse's compatibility were part of medieval engagement traditions. In certain areas, engaged couples were permitted to sleep together while still wearing clothing, with a wooden board known as a bundling board separating them. Families were able to assess the couple's physical compatibility through this practice, without running the risk of becoming pregnant or going against church teaching against premarital sex. A sophisticated history of fertility rites and sexual magic was passed down from previous pagan societies to the medieval era. Christian persecution forced these traditions underground, yet they never completely vanished. Ancient fertility rituals were still carried out by medieval peasants, either disguising them as Christian holidays or incorporating them into folk medicine. Despite religious efforts to curtail it, the May Day celebration nevertheless had significant sexual implications. In order to supposedly pick flowers and branches to adorn the settlement, young people would spend the night in the forest. In actuality, May Day provided a chance for courting and sexual exploration away from the typical constraints of village life. There was a spike in February births because many pregnancies were estimated to be the consequence of May Day interactions. Many fertility rites were performed as part of the wedding festivities in order to guarantee the couple's ability to conceive. In order to promote conception, the bride may be sprinkled with nuts or grain. In addition to being anointed with holy water, the marriage bed would be covertly prepared with fertility-boosting herbs and charms. These behaviors were a last-ditch effort to regulate reproduction in a society where having healthy children was essential to family survival and infant mortality was terrible. The medieval conception theory was a perverse synthesis of Christian teaching, folk wisdom, and Aristotelian philosophy. Medieval doctors thought that during sexual activity, the seed produced by both men and women mingled to form new life. They propagated the unfortunate idea that women who fell pregnant after being raped must have relished the event because they taught that female orgasm was essential for conception. Intricate notions regarding how to affect an unborn child's sex were devised by medieval people. They thought that having children during some moon phases would result in male offspring, while other moon phases would create female offspring. It was believed that the child's sex personality and chances for the future were all influenced by the stars at the time of conception. During the Middle Ages, more advanced techniques for monitoring and controlling sexual activity emerged. The Church set up networks of informants who provided information on their neighbors' personal lives, with priests interrogating penitents about their most private moments. Confession evolved, and became a means of obtaining personal information regarding sexual activities. Sexual persecution increased to new heights with the emergence of the Inquisition. In the 13th century AD, torture was used to coerce suspected heretics into divulging their sexual and religious habits. Inquisitors' interrogation guides asked specific inquiries concerning sexual positions, the frequency of sex, and even the physical sensations of sex. Sexual offenses had particular penalties in medieval prisons. If found guilty of adultery, women might be kept in cramped cages that prevented them from standing up straight and fed only bread and water until they starved to death. Before being hanged, those found guilty of rape may be publicly castrated. These severe penalties were intended to scare the entire community into sexual cooperation, in addition to punishing the guilty. The majority of the extensive literature on sexual education and guidance created throughout the medieval era was kept secret from the general public. Only well-educated doctors and affluent patients have access to the thorough explanations of sexual positions and procedures found in medical texts. Medieval people generally learned about sex through folk songs, whispered talks, and the painful process of trial and error. Although the Church published its own sexual literature, its main focus was on listing sins rather than offering constructive advice. Hundreds of sexual activities were documented in penal texts, along with the associated penalties. Contrary to the Church's official stance on celibacy and purity, these books demonstrate an obsession with sexual detail. The sexual lives of the nobles are revealed in medieval marriage manuals created for affluent clients. These books provided guidance on everything from how to handle sex during pregnancy to how to handle wedding night. They disclose a sophisticated awareness of sexual pleasure that was concealed from the general public but was obviously enjoyed by those with the means to maintain discretion and privacy. During the Middle Ages, more complex techniques for controlling and punishing sexual behavior emerged. The extreme efforts some medieval people attempted to suppress female sexuality are symbolized by the chastity belt, which is likely less frequent than popular culture indicates. These tools served as symbols of the fear around female sexual autonomy, in addition to being physical constraints. At the same time, medieval brothels were both permitted and prohibited. Although prostitution was officially prohibited by the Church, it was frequently tolerated and regulated by secular authority. Prostitutes operated under government supervision in designated red light districts in medieval cities. These women had to live in specific places, wear distinctive dress, and be subject to routine medical tests. Some of the strangest sexual practices in European history emerged during the medieval era. Feudal lords were said to have had the right to have intercourse with their peasant brides on their wedding night, a practice known as the rite of first night or The idea of this practice demonstrates the total sexual vulnerability of medieval peasant women, even though historians disagree as to whether it ever happened. People in the Middle Ages thought that sexual behavior could affect everything from the success of military operations to the weather, because they believed that the cosmic influences present at conception would affect their children's destiny. Kings and nobles sought advice from astrologers regarding the optimal periods for sexual activity. Army leaders may advise their troops not to have sex prior to combat because they think it may deplete their martial vigor. More advanced techniques for sexual surveillance and control emerged during the Middle Ages. In order to control sexual behavior, village societies created complex social pressure systems. Married couples were expected to live their private lives in accordance with social norms, and young people were rarely permitted to be alone together. Religious beliefs regarding the nature of the body and soul had a significant impact on medieval conceptions of sexual pleasure. The devil put up sexual pleasure as a trap to divert people from spiritual reflection, according to church doctrine. Excessive sexual pleasure was regarded as a sin that could send a person to damnation, even in marriage. Intricate methods for controlling one's body and sexual desire were created by medieval people. Sexual impulses were repressed by physical humiliation, cold baths, and fasting. Teenagers were instructed to stay away from things like particular foods, music, and entertainment that could cause sexual arousal. There was a huge underground culture of sexual transgression and rebellion during the Middle Ages. People in the Middle Ages discovered ways to express their urges and seek pleasure in spite of the Church's attempts to regulate human sexuality. The official culture of control and repression coexisted with this underground realm of sexual rebellion. Practical factors that are rarely taken into account by modern people influence sedative sexuality. Sexual activity frequently took place in areas shared with children, servants, and extended family members due to the lack of seclusion in medieval dwellings. In ways that would shock contemporary sensibilities, the sounds and smells of sexual activity were a part of everyday life. Relationships between sexuality and social status became more intricate during the Middle Ages. The nobility's wider pattern of social dominance included their sexual privileges. Due to their access to private rooms, exotic cuisine, and free time, lords and ladies were able to indulge in sexual pleasure in ways that peasants could not. In the end, medieval marriage was more about survival than it was about love or sex. The main goal of marriage was to have children who could cultivate the land and pass on the family name in a world with low life expectancy and high infant mortality. At best, sexual pleasure was viewed as a secondary factor and frequently as a risky diversion from more pressing issues. In addition to some of the most restrictive sexual practices in European history, the medieval era witnessed the emergence of complex forms of sexual rebellion and resistance. Despite the intense social pressure to live up to social and religious norms, people in the Middle Ages managed to express their wants and seek pleasure. We may comprehend Margot's horror as the weight of a whole culture's sexual worries pressing down on her young shoulders, not simply as personal fear as we revisit her in her stone hut, Henrik's hands still reaching for her in the flickering twilight. She bears the weight of societal surveillance, family honor, religious doctrine, and her own urgent need to survive in an unprotected world. The medieval era serves as a reminder that social control, fear, and power have always influenced human sexuality. Although the strange customs and beliefs of the medieval people may seem strange to us today, they were derived from the same basic human needs and desires that motivate sexual behavior throughout history. Knowing medieval sexuality enables us to see how the social worries and power dynamics of our own day are reflected in our own sexual culture. Intimacy in the Middle Ages was never really intimate. It was always risky, always political, and always public. In the bedroom, the most intimate moments of a person's life were regulated by laws that appeared to be intended to minimize pleasure and increase sorrow. It was a battleground where souls were won and lost, where family honor was upheld or destroyed. Some of the most restrictive sexual practices in European history emerged during the medieval era. However, it also highlights how resilient human sexual desire is. Medieval humans managed to pursue love, pleasure, and close relationships in spite of centuries of religious persecution, societal control, and legal penalty. Their experiences serve as a reminder that one of the most essential facets of the human experience is sexuality, which is too potent to be fully subjugated by any form of authority. Medieval Europe's peculiar and frequently unsettling sexual customs weren't just the product of superstition or ignorance. They resulted from the intricate interplay of social structure, religious dogma, economic need, and true human need. We can better appreciate our progress and the ways in which many of the same underlying tensions still influence human sexuality. Today, when we have a better understanding of these behaviors, ultimately, the medieval era tells us that sexuality is always necessary to the human experience, always perilous, and always political. In an effort to reconcile these enduring conflicts between pleasure and peril, love and survival, and desire and control, medieval people engaged in strange, intimate customs. Their hardships serve as a reminder that the pursuit of sexual freedom and genuine intimacy is an enduring human need that predates all historical periods. Henrik reaches for young Margot, the candlelight still flickering across his aged face. However, we now know that the full force of medieval sexual culture is there in this period. Despite insurmountable odds, the terror, the superstition, the desperate hope for life, and the enduring human desire for connection, we witness not just two individuals, but the clash of a whole civilization's sexual worries and desires in the most intimate setting possible, as evidenced by her shaking hands and his rough fingers, but never really safe, never really private, and never really. If you enjoyed this journey through history, make sure to subscribe to History Nest, where every night a new story takes flight.